This is the Cherryleaf Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Cherryleaf Podcast. I'm Ellis Pratt. I'm one of the directors and co-founders of Cherryleaf. And this is the second episode on the theme of leadership, change and communication, which we're doing with Ben French. And Ben is a consultant and business coach specialising in leadership development. And Cherryleaf, if you don't know what we do, we write clear, practical policies and procedures that reduce ambiguity, capture critical knowledge and help staff make the right decisions. For today, what we're going to be talking about is compassionate compliance, leading through regulation and risk. And questions like how can leaders use policies to protect their people while meeting legal obligations and without making staff feel policed or micromanaged? And why does compliance so often feel like the enemy of good work? Hello, Ben.
Hello. How's it going, Alice?
It's fine, thank you. It's not too hot today, thank goodness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's start off by framing the problem. You've got a lot of experience working with organisations. When you walk into one and it's one that's struggling with compliance, what does that feel like? What are the signs that things are going wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I was thinking about it in that I feel like there's sort of two broad categories of organizations that are struggling with compliance. And if I think back to some of my sort of work actually being part of an organization, part of a company, I think that companies get to a certain size and they're making a shift. And often what I think you see anyways is almost there's a sense of friction. There's what you have in terms of how we make decisions or how you're thinking about decision making stops working as well. And people are starting to pull at the edges and you can sort of feel anyone in the management roles can start to see that they're just feeling like they're taking on more and more risk and they don't quite know how to manage it. So their pressure is going up. And I think what you then tend to see is a sort of almost an over policing of the decision-making process. So, that a symptom in an organization that sort of at that stage is a bit more mature, but it's starting to move from that, 100 to 200 people type to, 500 people type. It's almost like they're sort of starting to put in place so many little almost pieces of scaffolding around what their process, that the process is not really clear anymore, and it feels really cumbersome. And so you hear junior staff basically saying, this is really cumbersome, we can't take decisions, we feel micromanaged, we're frustrated, everything's so slow around here. And senior staff going, we don't know who's doing what, we feel like we don't have enough information, we don't have oversight. So I think that's one type of organization, and tends to be a bit bigger, a bit more mature. I think the other one is actually the sort of smaller, slightly more nimble startup in a transition phase, really, from maybe 20-ish people to 50, 60, 100. And that piece is much more about, I think that tends to be a little bit more top down, and you tend to have the board starting to say, we don't understand how we are managing our risks. What is the process through which we're managing risk? How are we ensuring that we are taking consistent decisions? So you have this sort of top-down sense of almost a feeling of loss of control. We don't know what's going on, tends to be the question you hear. And the people at the bottom actually don't mind, right? Because they're still doing what they're doing. And they've joined this organization because it's growing and it's so they're quite happy just continuing to stretch. And I think what you can find in that environment is that you start to get policies applied, and because people aren't consulted, the board starts to say we need more control, we need more oversight, put in place a project gate system, for example, and it doesn't get used, or people are really frustrated with it, and so it just becomes a cumbersome process. And so in both cases, you basically have the top saying we feel uncomfortable, we don't know what's going on, and in the bottom, in one case rebelling against it, in the other case basically just feeling like they have they're micromanaged and they can't actually do anything.
That sounds very similar to situations where we've been called in, often seems to be driven by external funding. So they are going for an IPO and they want everything in place for investors, potential investors, or they've got private finance, and that's come with conditions of auditors checking that the company is robust, identifying holes, and then the organisation has to change from controlling its own destiny to also having to satisfy another party, satisfy the regulators, satisfy those people that are financing, and prove and implement the checks and balances that they want. And sometimes it's getting the balance right between that audience and doing the work, the daily work, the operations of the business. And that becomes interesting in keeping everybody going where they want the business to go, but also giving the evidence for people to be comfortable that there are checks and balances in place.
Yeah. And that feels very resonant in that sort of external factor, that external push to be compliant, which almost drives the process. But actually, then the problem is that it's driving one stakeholder's view of what the process needs to be, and it doesn't take into account the sort of needs of the organization necessarily in terms of actually making those decisions. Yeah, it's an interesting tension, that sort of what's needed externally, what does the organization need as it matures, and how do you sort of strike the balance?
Yes, and one of the approaches we take is that from an auditing perspective, and I spent nearly 2 years as a trainee auditor in the dim and distant past, is from that perspective, you want to check, are there controls in place? What's happening? And what staff want to know is, what should I be doing? How should I be doing things? And you can satisfy both of them if you provide both types of information. They don't compete, but sometimes one is provided, but not the other. And that's where policies and procedures can fall down. And you picking up on something you said earlier about compliance, I guess adding grit into the gears. When we were talking or prepping for this, I think you put down a note of the Department of No. When you talk about, and in your blog posts and other communication, talk about ordinary leadership, the stuff of leadership that doesn't make headlines but goes on. How does that kind of leadership get affected when compliance comes into play and can become an organisation can end up with a culture of surveillance?
So yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you were sort of just describing it. I think it's when the organization loses sight of what the point of the process is. So we talk about compliance, from an audit perspective. You should have a way of managing the risk related to a project that you're putting through. And as you get bigger as an organization, either because you've got more money or you've got more people, the people who hold the risk and own the risk get further and further away from the day-to-day doing. So they put more and more stuff into the process to give themselves assurance. And that might be sufficient for the auditors, but actually for the person doing the work, all of a sudden it starts to feel like a lot of oversight, a lot of process, a lot of bureaucracy. And that's often a word I hear is like, oh, we feel like we're really there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I think what tends to happen, and I think, and this is the sort of the tension organizations face, is that most organizations, I think, believe fundamentally want their staff, their sort of middle managers, that the teams that are working at the coalface or on the ground, they want them to take decisions, and they want them to see problems and then come up with solutions to them. And at the same time, they want that to be done in a way that is consistent with what they've said that they will do in terms of policy, being auditable, managing risk, and they want to know about things that are genuine risks that might get bigger. So you have this sort of tension. And when that balance goes out of whack, so when the company or organization doesn't calibrate that sort of trickle down / trickle up of information well, you end up squeezing out any sort of ability for anyone to lead at the bottom because they've lost all their decision rights. And at the same time, if you obviously expand the decision rights too much, then people at the top start to feel like they have no control, and they'll stop worrying about the policies, and they'll just start to talk to push on people. So you end up, I think, sort of having to have this conversation about calibration, and more than anything else is, what is it that we need our policies to do and say to make sure that the board and the executive feel like they have sufficient oversight to own the risks legally, and at the same time that people on the ground are actually doing the job that they need to do and taking decisions. They feel ownership of problems and challenges that they face, and they can take decisions to solve them in an appropriate context. So I think it's that type of leadership that gets eroded if you tighten the screws of policy too much or procedure too much. And at the same time, without some structure, equally, you lose that leadership. So it's finding that sweet spot in the middle, really, I think.
Yes, I agree with that. I am reminded of a person called Donald Miller, who I've heard on a couple of podcasts. And one of the things I remember him saying was leadership is about setting a North Star, what the goal is, why it's important, and where everyone fits in. And the challenge is to communicate that to people. And as you say, it's that roles and responsibilities aspect of where everybody fits in, what they are expected to do, where the boundaries are of things they shouldn't be doing, or areas where they should be using their own initiative to go to do things that are consistent with the ultimate goal of the organisation. Can you name a moment where you saw compliance damage an organisation, not just slow it down, but generally harm it? And was there a root cause for that?
So it's a really good question. The example that just jumped straight to my mind actually comes from one of the organizations I worked for quite a long time. And that organization was a bit bigger. It was going through a period of transition. And I think it had realized that its project management system was no longer appropriate for the types of projects it was managing and what it was trying to do and accomplish. So that all made sense. But the solution ended up being so complicated and so time consuming to roll out that I think what you ended up actually seeing was a process that took too long, that became overly complicated, that added multiple layers of decision making to the process, and actually led to sort of people, I guess, like myself, actually in that case, middle managers starting to feel pretty disempowered, but also spending just more and more time in meetings on compliance. Can we improve this project? Can we do this? Or have we managed to do this? Let's write a briefing note to get our managing director on board. And so it moved from a sort of nimble decision making, if slightly ad hoc, and so sometimes difficult to navigate decision making process, into an increasingly complicated, messy, and bureaucratized. And it fundamentally damaged, I think, that organization's ability to go for work, actively sort of go out and win work, and also the morale of staff. And what was interesting to me is that you think that you can't impose something top down, so the pieces just started to fall apart. And instead of having a good process that said, okay, we've gone from here, we've added this policy, and now we're moving on, we basically spent 2 or 3 years constantly revisiting this one policy or the sort of structural process to take it apart, tinker with it, fix it, remove pieces, and it never really worked. So you ended up with just a really messy, less consistent process. And and probably more damage than it was worth. And not to say that that process wasn't important, because I think it probably was, but I think that could have been done in a much simpler way that would have still brought in the compliance that was necessary in terms of managing the risks.
You remind me of an NHS project that we did. There was a trust, quite a large trust with geographically spread, and they had various policies around data security because of patient records, and occasionally patient records would end up in the wrong place. In those days, there were fax machines, and they had horror stories of consultants faxing patient records to one hospital, but forgetting the STD code and it coming out on the fax machine of a chip shop and other places, which then leads to disciplinary actions. So they had a policy for email, a policy for memory sticks, a policy for cybersecurity, a whole range of them, but none of them were joined up. And so we were looking at it from, I guess, a jobs to be done perspective. You want to send some records by email to an organisation. And to practically do that would mean having 5 different procedures open, or policies open at the same time, to double check you were complying with them. It wasn't orientated towards the work that people actually did. It wasn't joined up in that way. So that was the task that we did, was to make it cohesive and clear related to the tasks that people actually were doing. Because they didn't want... The whole disciplinary thing just took time, it demotivated staff, and was triggered by something going wrong. And they really had a strong need to just fix that problem.
And I really like that example, because it sort of so much highlights the fact that often in these cases, there is a problem, that something's starting to go wrong, is that sort of friction in the system. But the solution's often not more process or policy, it's often simplification. And I think clarifying why people actually want to do this, so that they understand the purpose behind the policy. I imagine that most people in an NHS trust do not want to be sending patient records to a chippy, and they're not doing it intentionally. So actually, how do you simplify the process, make it easier for people to check in on things, and then also, be really clear about the purpose of the policy that you do have, so that everyone can get on board with it.
Yeah, there's a trap there. You reminded me of, some people see that can all be solved through software. You just put checks and balances into the software to do that. And others that it can be done through training. And they do play a part, but you do also need to have that reference content, because not everything can be driven and be done through automation. It often involves human interaction, people talking to other humans, doing things from one system to the next.
Yeah. And actually, sorry, Ellis, it's just interesting, because you just made me think about the sort of the world we're in now with AI. And I think one of the big leadership and policy challenges actually is exactly what you've just said, is this really interesting challenge of the system can do a lot more, so that we feel like we can automate more. The problem is that you still actually have to take some decisions about what you want to share with a large language model or an AI system and a big database. And how is that compliant? How is it going to be compliant? Mm-hmm. And you also want people to not feel like their job is disappearing because now they're outsourcing a chunk of it to AI. So what's the purpose of what they're doing, and how are they actually still taking ownership of the wider decision context? And does that open up space for them? So yeah, it's a really interesting challenge about setting purpose, but then also thinking through that, that you can't just rely on one thing. You can't just rely on software. You can't just rely on writing it down. You can't just rely on training. It is that package, isn't it?
And picking up on what you said about decisions, one consistent theme that's coming through from the experts in AI is that AI is weak at decision making. That's where humans and experts are needed, and you can automate things that don't require a decision to be made. But where that comes into play, then you really do need well-trained, expert people to do that stage in the activity.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting point, isn't it? Because it is that, well, especially if we're thinking large language models, but most AI, it's probabilistic. So it's essentially just an odds-based calculation on the right decision, which is obviously not what you want. You want people to take responsibility, don't you, in terms of leadership, and to say, okay, we're using this system responsibly by helping it synthesize information or helping us sort of run a process more efficiently. But at these decision points, we still need to understand what's being said and done, and actually take on ownership, take leadership for that decision, because we are still taking on the risk. You know, the legal world doesn't view AI as a being that can be prosecuted. So how do we make sure that understanding of the risk and the decision still sits with individuals, and so people feel that they own the process, even if they're not necessarily having to do as much of it as they might have had to 10 years ago or even 2 years ago.
Cognitive surrender was a buzzword I heard earlier in the week. And yeah, there is a temptation to surrender your thought process or surrender the decision making to an AI system. We had a topic of or theme for this episode of compassionate compliance. And you describe leadership as taking responsibility for change. In the context of regulation, what does it mean practically for a leader to take on that burden of risk, so that doesn't stay with the frontline staff, and where does compassion fit into that?
It's a really interesting sort of thought, and I feel like the conversation we're just having on AI links into it really nicely, because I think it goes sort of linking the pieces of the conversation together. What we've sort of said is that, you know, people want to, I think in general, have autonomy in their roles. Most people don't want to just be told what to do and then do it repetitively over and over again. And so we want policies that create space for individuals to understand their decision-making framework and understand what responsibility that they have, what authority they have to take decisions. What I think is really important that policy doesn't do, or procedure doesn't do, and in particular in terms of leadership's job fundamentally should be saying, look, we're responsible for driving this forward. We're responsible not just for the day-to-day process, but actually sort of seeing what is working and what isn't, and managing change. And my view would be that good policy recognizes the evolving risks and that sort of external environment, and then is adapted and it's sort of almost organic. It doesn't, it might be written down, but it doesn't stay static. It evolves to the risks that leaders see. So when we talk about absorbing the risk, I think the job of somebody in a leadership role is to look around and say, okay, well, what are the risks that are facing us right now? And then how are we using the tools at our disposal, the policies, the regulations, the procedures, to enable decision-making that protects the organization and the individuals, but also allows people to get on with and carry out their jobs and take decisions. And you know, I think that's where a leader needs to be really compassionate, is that their job isn't to just pass it down and enforce regulation and just say you have to do it this way, nor is their job to sort of abdicate responsibility and say, well, you know, the policy says this, you go for it. Their job is to understand and sort of connect both upwardly, recognize what the board or the auditors might want to see, and then also downward into their teams and go, okay, these are the risks that face us. This is how we can adapt and address them so that we can continue to take on the challenges that we're facing. So it's that sort of balance of using policy sort of dynamically, I think, to help you make better decisions and manage the risks that face your team.
That reminds me, we've run a number of courses for fire and rescue service organisations in the UK, and there's lots of turnover of fire officers. And there's the law. So things like using cameras at a fire incident, there's the law of what you can and can't film, what you can do with the filming of it. Can you use it for training purposes? All manner of that, which is legally controlled with all of the legal penalties. And then there's also this thing of there are fire officers who are expert in fires that need to be allowed to make decisions on how do you put that fire out. And so what the fire service has done is they've created something called National Operational Guidance, which is top level guidance, government driven or centrally driven guidance. But it's guidance. It's a one-stop shop for best practice and of good practice rather than best practice. And with the idea that each local fire and rescue service can take that and then adapt it and tailor it to their own particular needs. They're not imposing this is the one and only way of doing it, but saying this is the experience from all the different fire services of what works well. This is what we recommend. You can adapt it to what's right for you.
Yeah, so, sort of the use of guidance, really, fundamentally.
Yeah. But also within the context of also specifying mandatory information, what the law says they must do, and then how they can do things and comply with the law. And that's so when we've run training courses to give them the skills to write the procedures, it's addressing how can you explain what you must do, and then how to apply those legal obligations to what you're writing and explaining why you have to do certain things in certain ways. You mentioned we a couple of times earlier, and we as a tool within language. How have you seen experience of how you can use we in communication genuinely rather than it coming across as a buzzword or in a patronizing way?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? We, because if you use we, sometimes we is actually quite a confusing statement because it's who's actually doing the work. Are we doing the work? Are you doing the work? Am I doing the work? And I think that it's patronizing, and it will come across as patronizing if I know as a sort of a manager or somebody that I'm not going to do the work, but I say we need to do this. But actually, you're the one who's going to do the heavy lifting. I think that can be quite patronizing. On the other hand, I think talking in particular, actually, about regulatory work or policy, talking very clearly about we as something that is shared, and it's a shared responsibility. We are in most organizations all responsible collectively for the policy. It can be very empowering because you're saying, look, it's not just me as the leader or the manager who is responsible for enforcing this policy. We are all responsible for the health of the procedures, the organization. And if the documents that we have and the ways of working that we've written down in terms of our policies, guidelines, procedures don't serve us, then we need to reflect on them and potentially change them. I think that's a different type of conversation. It's much more genuine about how are we working together versus saying, well, we need to do X, but actually what I really mean is, Alice, you need to go away and, have a look at that policy. So I think it's that sort of finding that balance in terms of how individuals engage with each other. And especially in a sort of senior, more sort of leadership or management role, it's really finding that balance of what are you jointly doing, and it is genuinely a we, versus when are you asking or requesting or directing, which is more about you or I'm instructing.
Can you think of any real life examples of a leader who's done regulatory change well?
So actually the project that we sort of met on, I think it's a nice example of trying to take an organization from where it is to where it needs to go. And I think it's a good example in that recognizing that you couldn't just impose a set of policies and procedures from the top. and sort of having the openness to go, okay, well, what's right, and almost feel it out. I think that was just a really nice example, actually, of doing the regulatory process well, and at the same time recognizing that it needs to be done, and also that it takes time. And so in this organization, I think we were lucky, and the sort of individual we worked with was lucky that they were given the space and time to do it. But what I thought was really impressive is that he did a lot of work to manage upwards towards the board, to help them understand what was needed, to sense check with them what they actually wanted, and to right size the framework in terms of policies. And we actually started at that level, thinking about what's the framework, what are the guidance. But at all points in time, the sort of senior executive was kept in the loop, and people were allowed and given space to feed in as to what was right for them and what wasn't. And then that sort of filtered down into the teams to allow teams to actually shape the structure of the policies. And you'll know from having worked on that some of that was better and some of that was less good in terms of engagement. But I think the process and the way that the individual leader was trying to achieve the change in the end outcome was really, really quite positive.
I think it really helped that project that there was that person driving it along and making sure that people gave it the attention it deserved. And it was interesting. My YouTube feed suddenly come up with various interviews about this project related to sport and how poorly that sector, football academies, is in America compared to the rest of the world. And I didn't realise quite the difference in how it's run in different countries and the impact that it has. So in America, their ability to qualify into the World Cup, I don't think they've done it particularly well in recent years, and that's driven because they have a poor process pipeline from children to professional adults doing the work. And this organisation is all about getting the pathways in place from child to adult, and are very successful in doing that. And it gave me appreciation of how well run or how many good things that organisation is doing compared to elsewhere.
Yeah.
So if you come across a director who's inherited a compliance culture that's already broken, and there's distrust and there's rule for the sake of rules, you're asked to come in, where do you start?
So it's always the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think that in general, if you're working with that director, it is part of the question to them is, well, what are you open to trying? Because for me, the starting point is go out and listen. What are the pain points? What are people frustrated about? Why are they frustrated? Why is a policy or procedure even in existence in the first place? Back to your NHS point, right? If you've got I imagine that trust had built up over time as new systems came in, a new policy.
Yes.
Because they felt like they needed the accountability, but no one had actually probably paused to think, well, why are we creating a USB policy and an email policy and a fax policy? Or, how can we merge our sort of data management or information sharing policies? And I think that's often very underestimated in terms of any sort of change, is the listening phase of just asking why and genuinely trying to figure out what's going on before you sort of start to say, well, okay, this is what we're going to do. I think then the second process is, again, it's not that big bang, okay, we're going to change everything. It's actually going, okay, these are the challenges and problems, and figuring out which are the ones you can solve relatively quickly. So, for example, are there a set of policies that just actually are no longer relevant, are not protecting the company, are making people's lives worse? Can you just get rid of them? That's a quick win that will buy you support, generate momentum, make people more supportive. At the same time, you might have a set of policies or challenges that are genuinely complex. The policy or the regulation or the procedure exists for a reason. It's managing a risk, but it's become really complicated. So can you bring a group of people together to actually work on that, so that rather than it feeling like it's a top-down imposition, you're moving people along in that process together. And then there might be some things that you're like, okay, well, we need to take these away and actually figure out how we manage that with the board. Where, where's the problem sit? So I think that second stage is sort of what are the quick wins, but also how can you start to buy people into the process? And then the third stage is sort of the testing and iterating, and just being very wary. I think in particular in the world of sort of procedures and guidance and regulation in an organization, that you don't let it drag out and become a 3-year thing. I think it's okay to say, look, we're going to put something in place and we're going to test, we're iterate, and we're going to adapt it as it goes, and we'll visit it every year. And if that's what you need to do, then do that. But don't let the process become so long, because actually, no, I don't think very many people are really motivated by talking about the procedures in an organization. They want to do the work. And for businesses that are trying to grow, they need to be outward looking. So you do need to do some of the inward looking work, but make it short, discreet, with a commitment to revisiting it when you find out what's working and what's not working. So I think if you do those 3 things, you'll tend to have more success in sort of revising the wider policy environment.
I want to pick up on something you said there. Often the choice is between do the easy stuff so you build confidence, or do the complicated stuff that will provide the biggest benefit. You mentioned a third one, which is look for the waste and delete stuff that's not necessary, to streamline things in that way. And I think that's often forgotten. And that pruning of stuff that's not needed links into a thing that we talk about, and that is that procedures shouldn't be a snapshot in time. They're not a momentum of how things were X years ago. It does require constant gardening of pruning stuff that's no longer needed and adding stuff or changing stuff to reflect how things are today.
And actually, it's a really nice point, because as with almost everything in organization culture, leadership, the procedures, if we forget to do the gardening and the weeding, it becomes overgrown and difficult to disentangle, and it doesn't work as well. And so actually, often, as much as anything, can you set out and articulate a process or a way that you're going to do that on a regular basis that doesn't feel onerous, but enables people to know that if they feel something's not working, they will have a voice and they will have an opportunity to sort of tweak it and improve it, or get rid of it if it's no longer appropriate.
And is there a particular test to decide whether a rule should stay or go? How you tell what's a genuine safeguard from just noise?
So really, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it will vary depending on the industry. I think if you're in the oil and gas, or in a very heavily regulated industry, fundamentally, you're going to have quite a lot of procedure that you have no choice in, or you're at least going to have a lot of compliance that you have no choice in, and that will lead to a lot of procedure that you need to put in place. And so I think as like a first test, often the first question needs to be, well, what are we legally required to do? What do we legally need to have in place to be compliant as a business, as an organization? And unfortunately, I think sometimes, when I was actually talking to people recently, especially for sort of charities or smaller organizations, that can feel quite burdensome in and of itself, because there is still quite a lot of regulation. So I think that's a really good starting point, is just make a list of what are we required to do by law or by our governing body. And then I think the second question often is to the board or the trustees who fundamentally own legally the risk, which is, what do you need to feel confident that the company is managing these compliance issues appropriately? And I think sometimes people forget that boards change over time, and you might have had a board that really wanted to, because of a moment in time or transition, a lot more compliance. But actually going back to the board and sense checking what is appropriate, and actually I have an example of that I'll come back to, just is really important. And then I think at that point, you sort of sense that this is what we need to do. So make sure you're doing that, and actually ask yourself the question, in order to achieve this, what is the bare minimum we need to do? Because actually the bare minimum over time will expand. So, stripping things back to the bare minimum, it's a little bit like pruning a hedge that's fast growing. You often can take it back a lot further than you do because it will grow back out. And I think that's the same with policy and procedure. And the example that was just in my mind is I sit on the board of a multi-academy trust. And it's been really interesting because they're growing and we're bringing in more schools. But it started actually quite small. And so the board's role in the compliance and governance and oversight was really hands-on. And the procedure and the process and the review of even policy reflected that most of it sat with the board, and often the board was really involved in it. As we're maturing, we're going back through this conversation now almost on an annual basis to say, well, as a board, we are a governing body. We're not a doing body. So are we getting the calibration right in terms of what needs to come to us versus what sits with the executive? What is it that we need to see to be confident that our legal responsibility is being fulfilled? And I think that's a really interesting question to sort of keep asking yourself in order to filter it down. Sorry, that was a longer answer, but
no, it's really interesting because I was thinking of there's a tendency in this country of gold plating everything, and often we'll get asked how long does it take to rewrite our procedures, which is like how long does it take to write a software application? You do need to scope the work, and that is important. And then also with that is then triage it or prioritize it. What are the things that you have to do, which are the things you should do and things you don't need to do? And then you can help to plan and realize how long this is going to take, how much effort it's going to require. And if you're bringing in external resource, get a sense of the budget that you need to allocate to it as well. Yeah. So we've sort of answered the question of where does somebody start and focus at the beginning, in that it's scoping the work and prioritizing the aspects and looking at what isn't needed so that you don't get bogged down in that. Is that a fair summary, or would you say there's anything else that somebody should do consider when they wanted to prioritize this and think about the initial stage?
I think that's it. I guess the only other thought that jumps to my mind is I think there is a value in having a really open conversation about risk and doing a bit of a risk-based prioritization, because it's tempting to do everything all at once, but that's overwhelming for an organization. And so actually asking yourself the sort of third question, I suppose, which is what risks are we most willing to carry in terms of a policy not being up to date or a policy being not fit for purpose, but it's one that we don't feel is a significant risk to us. So but maybe not a great example, but the example that jumps to mind is an organization that doesn't deal with too much personal data. Updating your data information and sort of GDPR compliant policy might not be the first thing you do if you've got a whole set of other regulatory things that you actually do need to have in place and you feel are a bigger issue for your team. So sort of it's making that risk assessment. And I think from an organizational perspective rather than perhaps on the leadership front, I think that the challenge is to get the board and the executive to be having that conversation really efficiently, because the board needs to say this is the risk we're comfortable with, but the executive needs to be sort of providing the sort of perspective and the judgment and the sort of operational this is how it is, and having that back and forth with the board.
You remind me of the anti-modern slavery policy. And for one organization, so there are different rules for the size of the organization based on turnover, and we were involved with one project where there was a holding company, so technically they had a very high multi-million turnover, a very, very small team within that. So anti-modern slavery was something that was unlikely to, in reality, to be a high risk. But from a legal perspective, organisations are meant to provide annual reports and audits of assessing what risks and mitigations they've got in place. So do they de-emphasize that because it's very unlikely to happen, or do they prioritize it because there are potentially legal fines if it were to happen, or if they hadn't completed these audits and published them on their websites? And those are not decisions that we can make as Cherryleaf. It's there for the board of the organisation to decide whether what they do with that priority. And it's not in some ways it's a tricky and challenging question to decide.
Yeah.
I think as a final question, let me pose this: what's something you believed about compliance 5 years ago that you no longer think is relevant or believe?
That's a great question. I laugh because I think I probably would have sat in the camp of like, the more clearly you can write down a policy, the better that people will follow it. And I think there's real value in that. But I think probably what I believe now is that people have to understand the purpose of the policy. And so, we haven't really been able to touch on this today, but, when in some of our work we've done, I think both you and Ginny at different times sort of said, look, this doesn't need to be a lengthy document. We don't need to write everything down. Like, we need to get the general principles down. And I think that's probably something that's really changed for me, is that a good policy doesn't actually have to say everything. A good policy needs to be really clear about why it exists and what it's trying to achieve, what the expectation is of anyone who sits in that organization, and that the how can often be left a bit more open and more flexible to allow individual leaders and managers to shape the decision, so long as the purpose and the sort of the key outcomes essentially are really clear. And I think that for me sort of shifted my view on what you would write down. So in some cases that might still require laws, right? If you're highly regulated and there is a specific thing you have to do, then you're going to have to write it down because that's what you need people to see. But I think equally, if you are, if it's a policy that is relevant to you as an organization and how you work in terms of managing a risk and a way, or sort of setting a standard, it doesn't actually require a really complicated long policy document. And I think it really is that sort of piece about calibration, which is probably the thing I feel more clear on than I ever have, is that the goal of policy isn't to confine or constrain, it's to capture the culture and the values of that organization and how it wants people to work going forward. And that should be living, and it should adapt as things evolve and change. So it's sort of getting that balance right feels really important to me. It's definitely something that I probably didn't believe sort of 6 or more years ago. Yeah. That's
interesting. I remember we were involved with the policy relating to security, and it was very easy to fall into a rabbit hole of the security for the offices, security for the playing field, security for the stadiums, and going into all of the detail. There are rules that FIFA have, there are rules the organisation has, and I think FIFA Pro, which is the player organisation. So I think in the end we stripped it down to saying these are what these two external bodies require you to do, and this is what the organisation requires. Make sure you implement them, but in terms of each country and each location, that's going to vary, and you do it in the way it's appropriate for you, because one place might not have any public members, perhaps only parents arrive, and then others, there might be games with thousands of fans, and in the end, set the ground rules so everyone's clear on those, and then you can go from there for each particular situation, because a one-size-fits-all, it was going to end up with just this huge document where 90% just wouldn't be relevant to specific countries.
And it's such a good example of what we've just been saying is, what's the risk that the board needs to sort of think about? What's the role of the executive in creating space for leadership to identify the challenges and create solutions, but setting a consistent standard? And so actually just really simplifying and being like, look, our policy is very simple. We want to see this because this matters to us as an organization, and we need to see these two things. it's up to you as the individual responsible for that location to make sure that that is in place and to justify to us that that is. And I feel like that sort of meets the criteria of good policy because it's testable. Somebody can show up there and say, explain to us, demonstrate that you are complying with our policy, and and it's clear what the policy is, and it manages the risks in a clear way with authority sitting where is appropriate. So yeah, it's such an interesting one, isn't it?
It was a very interesting project. One of the privileges of doing this work, I think it's true for you, is you get to see the insides of different organizations, how they work and what's important to them. And it is fascinating because if you're doing a normal job, working in a bank, you only see the one organization. Whereas with these sort of roles that we do, you're seeing multiple organizations work around. Now, in the last podcast episode we didn't ask you how people can contact you if they've got a project and need for guidance on leadership. And so if somebody would like to have a chat with you or pick up more, ask questions about what we've discussed, what's the best way of contacting you?
Thanks, Alice. I mean, this has been great. And if anyone wants to work on policy and leadership together, we're a good team. We know that we work well together. So
yes.
But if you want to get in touch with me, the easiest way is to email me at Ben, so BEN at ordinaryleadership.org, and you'll find me there. You can also have a look at my website, www.ordinaryleadership.org, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Very easy, WB French. So that's how you find me. And I'm always interested in having a chat with anyone who's got a leadership or a team development challenge, policy related or not. So yeah. And
we'll put those details in the show notes as well.
Brilliant.
Bren, thank you.
Well, thanks, Alice. Yeah, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure. It's been really interesting.